Hi everyone, so this week our topic is deviance and crime. So to begin, just some basic definitions to get us started here. Deviance essentially refers to any violation of a cultural or social norm. So we talked a lot in the beginning of the semester about what norms are. Essentially, they are these socially constructed behaviors, values, and beliefs that kind of guide and inform what is considered appropriate and what is inappropriate for human beings to follow, right? So every society socially constructs their own set of norms. For example, in the United States, it's normative for us to wave at someone when we're saying goodbye. It's normative for us to greet someone with a friendly hello when we meet them for the first time, right? So there's these expected behaviors that we are socialized to follow, right? So deviance refers to any act that challenges that norm. So instead of greeting someone with a warm, hi, how are you when I meet them, if I would flick them off, right? If I would be breaking that norm of how we are supposed to greet people, I would be engaging in an act of deviance. So deviant acts can range in severity from breaking folkways, which are things like picking your nose, facing people in the elevator instead of facing the entrance, right? Things that we talked about before. But deviant acts can also be more severe in terms of things like breaking laws or breaking mores, like we talked about earlier in the semester. So examples would be committing murder, robbing a bank, even kind of subtle laws like jaywalking or speeding when you're driving, for example. Just as norms are socially constructed and vary across cultures, deviance is also relative and varies from one culture to another culture. And even within cultures, what is considered deviant varies. And we're actually going to do an exercise in just a minute here to really understand kind of the relativity of deviance, meaning just how one act might be completely deviant in some situations, but in different contexts, it might not be as deviant or not even seem deviant at all. Right? A bride wearing a red wedding gown would be considered deviant in the United States, but in India, it's actually a norm for brides to wear red on their wedding day. So that's just a cross-cultural comparison, again, to really emphasize how things in our society, including norms and values that we have, are socially constructed. We can always compare our own culture to other cultures, and then, of course, we can also look historically, too, and see how norms have shifted across time within the same society. So a crime specifically refers to a behavior that violates official law and is punishable through formal sanctions. So again, remember earlier in the year we introduced this concept of sanction, which is essentially either a positive or a negative reaction that we receive for either following or deviating from normative behaviors, right? So just like deviance, crime is also socially constructed. As a society, we get to determine what deviant acts should be formally sanctioned by the law. Right? So laws are socially constructed in society, right? They're things that policymakers get to vote upon, and policymakers are hypothetically at least informed by their constituencies. You know, if you've ever voted in an official election, typically on the ballot, they ask several questions to the general public asking, would you vote in favor or against a law that would support X, Y, and Z, right? So laws are things that we as a society create, you know? As a society, we have decided that it's illegal to break the speed limit. We have decided that it's illegal to shoplift. You know, those just seem like kind of basic things that you would expect are just naturally occurring in any given society. But of course, as sociologists, we recognize that virtually all components of the society that we live in are socially constructed, meaning that we as the humans, the inhabitants of that society, we give them meaning and we actually bring them to life by practicing them on a routine basis. So while we all have likely broken a law at some point, for example, I'm sure every one of you is guilty of speeding or jaywalking. You know, it doesn't need to be something extreme. Certain demographic factors make an individual far more likely of actually being charged with committing a crime. And we'll take a look at that in the next mini lecture of this series. But before we do that, I want to take some time now and do an exercise, which is, I'm bummed because this is typically one of the funnest days in class because this exercise always generates a really good discussion and kind of heated debate. But it's essentially just a task that's going to help us really see how much deviance and crime are socially constructed behaviors in any given society. So I'd like you to read through this list of behaviors on the left side of the screen here, and then label them on a scale of 1 to 8 with 1 being the least deviant behavior, so the behavior that you think is least against our society's norms, and then moving all the way up 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 to 8, which would be the most deviant behavior, so the behavior that is most against the norms of our society. So you can see the behaviors that are listed are shoplifting, speeding, sexual fetishes, lying, cannibalism, jaywalking, murder, and flag burning. Right, so why don't you pause the video where you're at right now and get out a piece of paper and just rank these 8 different behaviors from 1 to 8, again with 1 being what you think is least deviant and 8 being what you think is most deviant. And then in just a second I'll advance to the next slide once you press play, and you can see how your answers compared to mine. All right, so this is how I ranked these behaviors, and I'm anticipating that for the majority of you, you probably have somewhat of a similar ranking comparison because the majority of us were raised in the same society. So we've been socialized into the same norms. We've been socialized to understand what behaviors are acceptable and what behaviors are deviant. And likely you ranked something similar to this. So you can see I ranked the least deviant as lying, then jaywalking, 3rd speeding, 4th sexual fetishes, 5th flag burning, 6th shoplifting, 7 murder, and 8 cannibalism, right? So, and again, this really is going to be dependent on your individual socialization, but for the most part, you probably have a list that's ranked similarly to mine because we are socialized in the same society. We've been taught the same values and beliefs as an American culture as to what is good normative behavior and bad deviant behavior, right? So keep that in mind, but now consider how you might rank these same behaviors differently with a little added context to them, right? So this list says the following behaviors: shoplifting to provide food for one's family, speeding on the way to the hospital, sexual fetish of bestiality, which means having sex with an animal, lying in court of law, cannibalism for survival purposes, jaywalking with suicidal motives, murder occurring out of self-defense, and flag burning as protest. All right. So the same behaviors that we looked at on the previous slide, but now they're provided in a different context. So again, why don't you pause the video, go ahead and rank these from 1 to 8, with 1 being what you think is least deviant to 8 being the most deviant, and then we'll carry on. All right, so this was how I ranked these behaviors given this new context that was added to each of these deviant behaviors from the previous slide. All right. Now I won't go into great explanation here, but just off the top of my head, I already notice that my ranking is very different than what I had for the first group without the context provided, just the behaviors on their own. This list, the context, really did seem to have a meaningful impact on how I rearranged the order of least to most deviant. All right. We have one more example that we can look at here. All right. Again, the same 8 behaviors, but this time again, just provided in a slightly different context. Right. So this time we have shoplifting because you're bored, speeding 50 miles over the speed limit, sexual fetish of sadomasochism, S&M, which is essentially like the 50 Shades of Grey type sex, you know, whips and chains, but consensual, mind you, consensual inflicting of pain upon oneself and others in a sexual and romantic environment, lying to your child about Santa, cannibalism for pleasure, jaywalking in the midst of a large crowd, serial murder, so killing multiple people, and flag burning ceremony to retire a flag. All right. So again, pause the video, take a minute, and reorder these from least to most deviant, given this new context that's been provided. All right, so here was how I ranked this particular group from least to most deviant. And again, I'm noticing that this ordering is different than both of the previous orderings that I did, right? So if I would just pull up a comparison now, this is how I ranked each of these three groups, right? Starting on the left with the first group where it just listed the behavior and didn't provide any context for us to really consider with that behavior. And then the second and third groups provided very different context for each of these behaviors in multiple ways, right? So just looking at that, let's look at the first one I had up there, right? Shoplifting in the first group, I ranked it one of the most deviant behaviors out of all of them. But then in this next context, when it was shoplifting to provide food for one's family, I felt a little empathetic. I thought about people, especially now in this current pandemic, that are financially strapped and are struggling to survive because they don't have enough money to eat and to pay their bills. So in that context, shoplifting, which seemed bad initially, but in this context, to do so just to help your family, to feed your kids, doesn't seem as deviant. It doesn't seem like it goes against the norms or the laws of our society. Even though shoplifting, regardless of the context, is still illegal, it seems less deviant, at least in my mind. And I'm anticipating that for many of you, you probably ranked shoplifting lower in this second set of examples when it was in this context of providing food for one's family, just in comparison to shoplifting on its own. Right. Let's see another one that had a little more variability in it for me, maybe. Oh, lying. This was interesting, right? On its own, I thought I ranked lying as being the least deviant of all these behaviors. But then when it was considered in the context of lying in the court of law, so committing perjury, that's a federal offense. You can go to jail for that. That seems a little more deviant than in comparison to just, telling a white lie. Oh, no, I can't go out tonight. I have a headache, when really you just want to stay at home and binge watch Netflix, So that didn't seem as deviant, but lying in the court of law, all of a sudden it turns lying from just a deviant act to an actual crime that can be punishable with jail time, right? And then again over here, lying to your child about Santa, I ranked it as a 3, so still relatively low. But in this case, I thought flag burning ceremony to retire a flag doesn't seem deviant at all. That's the way that we are expected in our society to retire flags. It's actually the politically correct way to do so. And then also I ranked it lying to your kids about Santa even worse than jaywalking in the midst of a large crowd. Thinking of, after a sporting event or a concert when there's literally hundreds or thousands of people flooded outside and everyone just kind of walks across the street together and not at a crosswalk. Yeah, it's still technically jaywalking, but police officers are standing everywhere directing traffic, and they don't seem to care if these groups of people commit this crime, right? Because in that context, it's not really severe, right? So hopefully what you're recognizing as you're working through this exercise and as I'm discussing this now, is that labeling any behavior as deviant or even criminal in some context really, really depends on the specific context in which the behavior takes place, right? So for example, if cannibalism, something that is very taboo in our society, right? The idea of a human eating another human is makes us cringe. But imagine you tried to scale Mount Everest and there was an avalanche and you got trapped in the snow and you were the only survivor and the only food source that was available to you was the bodies of the dead people that you were hiking with, and you had to resort to eating them. You're not likely, if you survive that, you're probably not going to get arrested for cannibalism. But if you're just found chewing on some human's leg in everyday circumstances, I don't know what the laws are on cannibalism because it's such a bizarre concept that we don't talk about in our society, but odds are you'd be treated very differently if you were considered a cannibal just for survival purposes versus being a cannibal for pleasure, as this other context provides, right? So even something as concrete as the law is socially constructed, which means that the way laws are interpreted are largely influenced by social factors. So things like bias and prejudice can have a big impact on whether or not certain laws get carried out, right? And we'll talk a little bit more about that now, but even in our previous discussions, think for example, when we were talking about race and we looked at all of those studies that found that medical providers and police officers do indeed have implicit bias against people of color, which means that we can expect people of color to be criminalized at higher rates in comparison to white people, which indeed they are, and we'll look at more evidence that supports that today. But also consider how something like being part of an in-group can affect whether or not you get charged with a crime, right? For example, if you get pulled over and the police officer recognizes that you have a police badge sitting on your front seat, maybe he's not going to give you a ticket because he knows that you're a brother in blue. And so that might be an advantage to you in some contexts, right? So we're going to continue unpacking these intricacies of crime and deviance and look more at some statistics.